William stood by the large window of Kensington Palace, watching the rain streak down the glass. His hands were shaking slightly as he held his phone. The message he had just received made his heart sink. Catherine walked into the room quietly, her face pale and tired. She had been crying earlier and her eyes were still red and puffy. They looked at each other without saying a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any conversation. Catherine moved closer to William and gently touched his arm. He turned to face her, and she could see the worry written all across his face. Something terrible had happened, and both of them knew their lives were about to change forever. The palace staff had been unusually quiet all morning. Even the guards who usually smiled and nodded seemed different today. There was a heaviness in the air that everyone could feel. William had spent the last 2 hours making phone calls, his voice getting more strained with each conversation. Catherine sat nearby, trying to hold herself together, but every few minutes her eyes would fill with tears again. Earlier that week, they had received news that William's grandmother had taken a sudden turn for worse. The Queen, who had always been a pillar of strength for the entire family, was now lying in a hospital bed, weak and fragile. The doctors had called the family together, which was never a good sign. William and Catherine knew what this meant. They had been preparing themselves mentally, but nothing could really prepare someone for losing someone they loved so deeply. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were at school, unaware of what was happening. William and Catherine had decided not to tell them yet. They wanted to wait until they knew more, but keeping this secret from their kids was tearing them apart inside. How do you explain death to children? How do you help them understand that someone they love will never come back? Catherine remembered the last time they had visited the Queen. She had seemed fine then, laughing and playing with the great-grandchildren. Louis had made her laugh so hard by doing silly faces. Charlotte had shown her a drawing she made at school. George had told her about his football match. The Queen had listened to every word, her eyes sparkling with joy. That memory now felt like it happened years ago, even though it was just last month. William walked over to the couch and sat down heavily. He put his head in his hands. Catherine sat beside him and wrapped her arm around his shoulders. They stayed like that for several minutes, neither of them speaking. Outside, the rain continued to fall, matching the sadness they felt inside. The phone rang again. William jumped up quickly to answer it. His face changed as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Catherine watched him carefully, trying to read his expression. When he hung up, he looked at her with tears in his eyes. "We need to go," he said softly. "Now," Catherine nodded. She had been expecting this call. They both knew what it meant. She stood up quickly and went to get her coat. Her hands were trembling as she buttoned it up. William was already calling for their driver. Everything was happening so fast, yet it felt like time had slowed down completely. The drive to the hospital was the longest journey of their lives. They sat in the back of the car holding hands tightly. Neither of them could find words to say. What could they say? The streets of London passed by in a blur. People were going about their normal days, shopping, laughing, walking their dogs. Life was continuing as usual for everyone else, but for William and Catherine, the world had stopped spinning. When they arrived at the hospital, several other family members were already there. Everyone's faces showed the same expression of grief and worry. They all hugged each other, offering whatever comfort they could. The doctors spoke to them in quiet, gentle voices. They explained that the Queen was stable but very weak. She had been asking for William specifically. William felt his throat tighten. His grandmother wanted to see him. He looked at Catherine and she squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Go," she whispered. "She needs you." He walked down the long hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Everything felt surreal, like he was moving through a dream. The fluorescent lights above seemed too bright. The smell of antiseptic filled his nose. He could hear machines beeping from different rooms. Each step took him closer to a moment he had been dreading his entire life. A nurse stood outside the Queen's room. She gave him a small, sympathetic smile and opened the door for him. William took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. His grandmother lay in the bed, looking so small and fragile. This woman who had ruled a nation, who had always seemed so strong and unbreakable, now looked like she could disappear at any moment. He walked slowly to her bedside and took her hand gently. Her skin felt papery thin and cold. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, a small smile crossed her face. "William," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came." "Of course I came," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'll always come when you need me." They talked quietly for a while. She told him things she wanted him to remember, advice she wanted to give him, memories she wanted to share one last time. William listened to every word, committing them to memory, knowing these moments were precious beyond measure. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. There was no point in pretending to be strong anymore. She squeezed his hand weakly. "Take care of them," she said. "Your family, your children, that's what matters most." "I will," William promised. "I will." When he finally left the room, Catherine was waiting in the hallway. She stood up immediately when she saw his face. They fell into each other's arms, both of them crying now. The other family members gathered around them, and they all held each other, drawing strength from being together. The doctor approached them carefully. "She's asking for all of you now," he said gently. "If you'd like to see her together." They all filed into the room quietly. The Queen looked at each of their faces, her eyes filled with love despite her weakness. This was her family, the people she had dedicated her life to protecting and guiding. Now it was time to say goodbye, though none of them wanted to speak that word out loud. The evening turned into night. The family took turns sitting with the Queen, talking to her, holding her hand, making sure she wasn't alone. William and Catherine stayed close to each other throughout it all, drawing strength from their partnership. They had faced many challenges together, but nothing had prepared them for this. As midnight approached, a nurse quietly told them that they should prepare themselves. The end was coming soon. William felt his chest tighten with grief. Catherine held his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They stood together by the bedside, along with the rest of the family, as the Queen took her final breaths. When it was over, the room fell completely silent. The beeping of the monitor had stopped. The woman who had been Queen for longer than most people had been alive was gone. William stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Catherine guided him gently out of the room, her own tears falling freely now. They walked back through the hospital corridors in a daze. Everything had changed in an instant. The world would wake up tomorrow to the news, but for now, in these quiet early morning hours, it was just the family and their grief. William and Catherine held each other in the car on the way back to the palace, both of them trying to hold back tears but failing. The palace felt different when they returned. The staff members who were awake stood in respectful silence as William and Catherine walked through the halls. News had already spread within the palace walls, though the public wouldn't know for several more hours. Every person they passed had tears in their eyes. Some bowed their heads, others whispered their condolences. The weight of what had happened was settling on everyone's shoulders. Catherine led William to their private quarters. He walked like he was in a trance, his mind unable to fully accept the reality of what had just occurred. When they reached their room, he finally broke down completely. Catherine held him as he sobbed, his whole body shaking with grief. She cried too, but quietly, trying to be strong for him even though her own heart was breaking. They stayed awake all night talking about memories, looking at old photographs, sometimes crying, sometimes just sitting in silence. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, but neither of them noticed. They were lost in their own world of sadness and shock. William kept saying he couldn't believe she was really gone. Catherine kept reassuring him that it would get easier with time, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. At 6 in the morning, they had to start making phone calls. The children's school needed to be informed. George, Charlotte, and Louis would need to be told before the news became public. William dreaded this conversation more than anything. How could he tell his children that their great-grandmother, who they loved so much, had passed away? Charlotte especially had been close to the Queen. She would be devastated. Catherine helped William prepare what to say. They practiced the words together, trying to find the gentlest way to deliver such harsh news. When the children woke up and came into their room, still in their pajamas, William and Catherine sat them down on the bed. The kids immediately knew something was wrong. George's face became serious. Charlotte's eyes grew wide with worry. Louis crawled into Catherine's lap, sensing the tension. William spoke slowly and carefully, explaining that their great-grandmother had been very sick and had passed away during the night. For a moment, there was silence. Then Charlotte started crying. George tried to be brave, but his chin trembled and tears spilled down his cheeks. Louis didn't fully understand what death meant, but he started crying because everyone else was crying. They spent the morning as a family, holding each other, answering the children's questions as best they could. Charlotte wanted to know if the Queen was in heaven. George asked if they could have said goodbye. Louis asked when they could see her again. Each question broke William and Catherine's hearts a little more. They did their best to comfort their children while dealing with their own overwhelming grief. By noon, the official announcement would be made to the public. William had to prepare a statement. He sat at his desk staring at a blank piece of paper, unable to write anything. Every word felt wrong. How could he sum up a lifetime of love and respect in a few sentences? How could he express what his grandmother had meant to him, to the country, to the world? Catherine sat with him, helping him find the right words. Together they crafted a message that came from the heart. When the announcement was made, the world stopped. Every news channel interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with tributes and messages of condolence. People gathered outside the palace gates, leaving flowers and cards. The outpouring of love and respect was overwhelming. William and Catherine watched from the window as thousands of people came to pay their respects. It was comforting to see how much the Queen had been loved, but it also made the loss feel even more real. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements and planning. There were meetings about the funeral, discussions about protocols, decisions that needed to be made. William tried to focus on these tasks because they gave him something to do besides grieve. Catherine worried about him. She saw how he was pushing himself too hard, not allowing himself time to process his emotions. She tried to get him to rest, but he insisted he needed to keep busy. The children were struggling too. Charlotte stopped eating properly. George became withdrawn and quiet. Louis had nightmares and wanted to sleep in his parents' bed every night. Catherine did her best to comfort them while also supporting William and managing her own grief. She felt like she was being pulled in a dozen different directions, but she held the family together with quiet strength. One evening, about 4 days after the Queen's passing, a palace staff member brought William an envelope. It was sealed with the Queen's personal seal. William's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from his grandmother. She had written it weeks earlier, knowing she didn't have much time left. Catherine stood beside him as he read it, tears streaming down both their faces. The letter was full of love and wisdom. The Queen wrote about how proud she was of William, how she knew he would be a wonderful king someday, how much she valued Catherine and the stability she brought to the family. She thanked them for the joy the great-grandchildren had brought to her final years. She reminded William to always put family first, to never forget where he came from, to rule with compassion and strength. Every word was a precious gift that William would treasure forever. At the bottom of the letter was a request. The Queen asked William to visit a specific address in Scotland. She didn't explain why in the letter, only that it was important and that he should go with Catherine. She wrote that they would understand when they got there. William and Catherine looked at each other in confusion. What could be at this address? Why was it so important to his grandmother? Despite everything they had to deal with, William felt compelled to honor this request. His grandmother had never asked much of him, and this seemed to matter to her. He told Catherine they should go as soon as possible. She agreed, though she had no idea what to expect. They made arrangements to leave the children with trusted staff and set out for Scotland the next morning. The drive was long and quiet. They traveled through beautiful countryside, but neither of them really saw it. They were both lost in thought, wondering what awaited them at this mysterious address. The location was in a remote area far from any major towns. As they got closer, William became more and more anxious. Catherine held his hand, offering silent support. When they finally arrived, they found themselves in front of a small, charming cottage surrounded by wildflowers and old trees. It looked like something from a storybook, peaceful and secluded. There was no one around, no signs of life. William checked the address 3 times to make sure they were in the right place. This was definitely it. They got out of the car slowly, looking around in bewilderment. Why had the Queen sent them here? What was the significance of this place? William walked up to the front door, his heart pounding. Catherine followed close behind. There was a key under the doormat, exactly where the Queen's letter said it would be. William picked up the key with trembling fingers. He looked at Catherine and she nodded encouragingly. He put the key in the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft creak. They both held their breath, not knowing what they would find inside. What they saw when they stepped through that doorway would change everything. William and Catherine stood frozen in the entrance, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Neither of them could speak. Neither of them could move. They just stared at what was before them, trying to understand, trying to process what they were seeing. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. William's face transformed from confusion to wonder. They looked at each other, then back at what lay before them. Slowly, smiles began to spread across their faces, the first real smiles since the Queen had passed away. The cottage was filled with memories. Every wall, every corner, every surface held pieces of history that William had never known existed. Photographs covered the walls, dozens and dozens of them, all in beautiful frames. But these weren't official royal portraits or formal family pictures. These were candid shots, personal moments captured in time. William stepped closer to examine them, his breath catching in his throat. There were pictures of his mother, Diana, as a young girl, laughing and carefree in a way he had rarely seen in other photos. There were images of his father as a child, playing in gardens and smiling widely. There were photographs of William himself as a baby, being held by his grandmother with such tenderness on her face. Catherine moved beside him, looking at a photo of their wedding day, but from an angle she had never seen before. It must have been taken by the Queen herself, but it wasn't just photographs. The cottage was filled with personal items that told stories. There were handwritten letters tied with ribbons, journals with worn covers, small toys that had belonged to royal children decades ago, pieces of jewelry with notes attached explaining their significance. Every object had been carefully preserved and arranged with love. William walked through the room slowly, touching things gently, as if they might disappear if he wasn't careful. Catherine followed, equally amazed by what they were discovering. In the living room, there was a comfortable armchair positioned by the window with a small table beside it. On the table sat a book, bookmark still in place as if the reader had just stepped away and would return at any moment. William picked up the book and saw his grandmother's handwriting in the margins, notes and thoughts she had written while reading. The kitchen was cozy and warm, with copper pots hanging from hooks and herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill. There were recipes written in the Queen's own hand, tucked into a wooden box. Catherine opened the box carefully and found not just recipes but also small notes. One recipe for scones had a note at the bottom that said, "William's favorite when he was 5 years old." Another recipe for chocolate cake had a note saying, "Diana loved this more than anything." Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. The larger one had a beautiful quilt on the bed, handmade with squares of fabric that each told a story. William recognized pieces of fabric from his childhood clothes, from his mother's dresses, from blankets that had wrapped royal babies for generations. Someone, probably his grandmother, had sewn all these memories together into something beautiful and comforting. The second bedroom was set up as a study. There was a desk by the window with a leather chair. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with books of all kinds, novels, histories, poetry collections, some so old their spines were cracked and faded. On the desk was another sealed envelope with William's name on it. His hands shook as he picked it up and carefully opened it. This letter was longer than the first one. The Queen explained that this cottage had been her secret retreat for over 50 years. It was a place she came when she needed to escape the pressures of royal life, when she needed to be just a grandmother and not a queen. She wrote about how she had filled it with memories of the people she loved most, how she had spent hours here sorting through photographs and remembering happier times. The letter went on to explain that she was leaving the cottage to William and Catherine. She wanted them to have a place where they could be themselves, where they could bring their children to play without cameras or protocols, where they could remember that before they were royals, they were a family. She wrote that she hoped they would add their own memories to these walls, their own photographs to the collection, their own stories to the cottage's history. William had to sit down as he finished reading. The gift was overwhelming in its thoughtfulness and love. His grandmother had created this sanctuary, and now she was passing it on to him. Catherine sat beside him, reading over his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just a cottage. It was a legacy of love, a tangible reminder that family was what mattered most. They spent hours exploring every corner of the cottage. In a closet, they found boxes of home videos, recordings of family moments that had never been made public. They found a box of toys that had belonged to William when he was a child, carefully preserved. They found letters that Diana had written to the Queen, full of love and respect. They found evidence of a relationship between his mother and grandmother that had been more complex and loving than he had ever known. Catherine discovered a hope chest in one of the bedrooms. Inside were baby clothes, tiny and delicate, that had been worn by royal babies going back generations. There was a christening gown that was over 100 years old, perfectly preserved. There were small shoes, hand-knitted blankets, silver rattles engraved with names and dates. It was a treasure trove of family history. As evening approached, they found themselves sitting on the cottage's small back porch, looking out at the garden. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Birds sang in the trees. The peace of the place was profound. For the first time since the Queen had passed away, William felt something other than grief. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for having had such a remarkable grandmother. Gratitude for this incredible gift. Gratitude for the love that surrounded him even in loss. Catherine rested her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The beauty of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. In the midst of their sorrow, they had found something precious and unexpected. William thought about bringing George, Charlotte, and Louis here. He imagined them running through the gardens, playing in the rooms, adding their laughter to the walls that had seen so much love already. He pictured them looking at the photographs of their great-grandmother and hearing stories about her life. This place would keep her memory alive in a way that felt personal and real. Inside the cottage, they found a fully stocked pantry and refrigerator. Someone, probably palace staff acting on the Queen's instructions, had prepared the cottage for their arrival. There was fresh bread, cheese, fruit, and wine. Without discussing it, they both decided to stay the night. Neither of them wanted to leave yet. This place felt safe and sacred, a bubble away from the rest of the world. Catherine prepared a simple dinner while William continued to explore. He found photograph albums he hadn't noticed before, filled with pictures spanning decades. He saw his grandmother as a young woman, as a new mother, as she aged gracefully through the years. He saw the constants in her life, the love she had for her family, the strength she carried with such grace. They ate dinner at the small kitchen table, talking quietly about what they had discovered. They shared memories of the Queen, laughing at funny moments, crying at poignant ones. The cottage held them in its warmth, making space for both grief and joy to exist together. After dinner, they built a fire in the fireplace and sat together on the sofa, wrapped in a soft blanket. Catherine found a music box on a shelf and wound it up. A gentle melody filled the room, sweet and slightly melancholy. William closed his eyes and let himself feel everything, the sadness, the love, the gratitude, the loss. That night, they slept in the bedroom with the memory quilt. The bed was comfortable, and the quiet of the countryside was soothing. For the first time in days, they both slept deeply, without nightmares or restlessness. The cottage seemed to wrap around them protectively, offering rest and peace. When they woke in the morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Birds were singing cheerfully. William felt different somehow, lighter. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it felt more manageable now. He understood what his grandmother had wanted him to find here. It wasn't just a cottage full of memories. It was hope. It was a reminder that love continues even after death, that family bonds transcend time, that beauty can be found even in sorrow. They spent the morning walking around the property. There was more to discover: a small shed with gardening tools, a path through the woods that led to a peaceful stream, a stone bench with an inscription they couldn't quite read because it had worn away with time. Catherine was the one who noticed the small door under the stairs. It was cleverly hidden, painted the same color as the wall. Easy to miss unless you were looking carefully. She called William over, and together they figured out how to open it. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. William found a light switch, and when he flipped it, they saw stone steps descending into what appeared to be a cellar. They went down carefully, the air getting cooler with each step. At the bottom, they found themselves in a surprisingly large underground room. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves were boxes and chests, each one labeled with dates and names. This was an archive, a collection of royal family history that had been carefully organized and preserved. William walked along the shelves, reading the labels. Some boxes went back over a century. Others were more recent. He found boxes with his own name on them, containing things from his childhood that he had completely forgotten about. There were school projects, artwork he had made, letters he had written, report cards, even a tooth that the tooth fairy had collected. His grandmother had saved everything. Catherine found boxes labeled with Diana's name. Inside were personal items that had belonged to William's mother, things that had been carefully stored after her death. There were dresses she had worn, jewelry she had loved, books she had read with notes in the margins, photographs from her travels, letters she had written to friends. William knelt beside Catherine as she gently went through these items, both of them crying as they connected with memories of a woman they had loved and lost. In another section, they found historical documents related to the royal family. There were old letters between kings and queens, documents with royal seals, photographs from coronations and weddings that went back generations. The queen had been the keeper of this history, making sure it was preserved for future generations. Now that responsibility would fall to William. What struck them most was how personal everything was. This wasn't a formal archive like the ones in the palace. This was a grandmother's collection of memories, organized with love and care. Every box they opened revealed something touching, something that showed how much the queen had valued family and history. They found a box that contained letters the queen had written but never sent. They were addressed to various family members, including several to William himself. Catherine suggested maybe they shouldn't read them, that perhaps they were too private. But William felt compelled to understand his grandmother better. With shaking hands, he opened the first letter addressed to him. It was dated from the day he was born. In it, the queen wrote about her joy at his arrival, her hopes for his future, her promises to guide and protect him. She wrote about the weight of the crown and her wish that he could have a normal childhood despite his destiny. She expressed fears about what the future might hold, and determination to prepare him as best she could. Reading her private thoughts from that day made William feel connected to her in a new way. There were other letters written at different points in his life. One from when he started school, another from when his mother died, another from when he met Catherine, and one from the day each of his children was born. Each letter showed a grandmother's love and concern, her wisdom and worry, her pride and hope. William realized these letters were his grandmother's way of processing her feelings, of working through the complex emotions that came with her unique position. Catherine found something else tucked away in a corner, a painting covered with a cloth. When she removed the cloth, they both gasped. It was a portrait of the entire family, but not an official one. This painting showed them all in casual clothes, sitting together in what looked like the cottage's garden. The queen was in the center, surrounded by children and grandchildren, everyone smiling and relaxed. It was how she saw them, not as royals, but as her family. The painting was beautiful and clearly done by a talented artist, but it had never been displayed publicly. William wondered if his grandmother had commissioned it just for herself, to hang here in her private sanctuary. On the back of the canvas was a date from 5 years ago, and a small note in the queen's handwriting that said simply, "My greatest treasure. They stayed in the cellar for hours, going through boxes, reading letters, looking at photographs. Every discovery added another layer to their understanding of the queen as a person, not just as a monarch. They saw her doubts and fears, her joys and sorrows, her deep love for family and her struggle to balance duty with personal feelings. When they finally climbed back up the stairs, it was late afternoon. They were emotionally exhausted, but in a good way. The grief they felt had transformed into something else, something that included sadness but also appreciation and understanding. They had been given a gift beyond measure, the chance to truly know the woman behind the crown. They decided to spend one more night at the cottage before returning to London. The funeral was in 3 days and they needed to be back for the final preparations. But they wanted just a bit more time in this peaceful place, this sanctuary that had been created with so much love. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the cottage's kitchen, they talked about what they would do with this place. They agreed to keep it private, to never tell the public about it. It would be their family's secret, a place where they could bring their children to connect with their heritage in a personal way. They would add their own memories to the collection, continuing the tradition the Queen had started. William found a journal in one of the drawers, its pages mostly empty. The first few pages had entries written by his grandmother, simple notes about her visits to the cottage, observations about the garden, reflections on life. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before she died. It said, "I hope William finds peace here the way I have. I hope he understands that love is the only thing that really matters in the end. Everything else fades away, but love remains." With tears in his eyes, William turned to a fresh page and began to write. He wrote about discovering the cottage, about what it meant to him, about the grief he felt and the gratitude he was learning to embrace. He wrote about his grandmother and the legacy she was leaving behind. When he finished, he left the journal open on the table, letting the ink dry, feeling like he had just had a conversation with his grandmother even though she was gone. Catherine added her own entry below his, writing about the impact the Queen had on their lives, about what she had learned from watching a woman balance incredible responsibility with genuine compassion. She wrote about bringing their children here and teaching them about the remarkable woman who had loved them so much. As darkness fell, they sat together by the fire again, each lost in their own thoughts. The cottage creaked and settled around them, a living space that held decades of love and memory. William felt his grandmother's presence strongly, not in a supernatural way, but in the evidence of her love that surrounded them. Every object, every photograph, every carefully preserved memory was proof that she had lived a life rich in love. They talked about the funeral, about what the next weeks and months would hold. The world would mourn the Queen publicly, with ceremony and protocol. But William and Catherine had been given something private and precious, a glimpse into the personal life of an extraordinary woman. They would carry this knowledge with them, drawing strength from it in the difficult days ahead. Before bed, William went back down to the cellar one more time. He wanted to look at the boxes with his children's names on them. He found that his grandmother had been collecting things for George, Charlotte, and Louis, preparing boxes of memories for them, even though they were still so young. There were toys she had given them, photographs of times they had spent together, little notes she had written about each child's personality and quirks. The care and attention she had put into these collections brought fresh tears to William's eyes. His grandmother had known she wouldn't be there to watch his children grow up, so she had created this archive for them, a way for them to know her even after she was gone. The morning they had to leave the cottage arrived too quickly. William and Catherine packed slowly, neither wanting to go but knowing they had responsibilities waiting in London. The funeral was tomorrow, and they needed to be there for the final preparations and rehearsals. The children would need them. The country would need them. Their private time of grief and discovery was coming to an end. Before they left, William walked through every room one more time, committing details to memory. He wanted to remember exactly how everything looked, how the morning light came through the kitchen window, how the floorboards creaked in the hallway, how the view from the bedroom window showed endless rolling hills. This place had become sacred to him in just 2 days, a connection to his grandmother that he could return to whenever he needed to feel close to her. Catherine gathered a few small items to take back with them. She chose one of the photographs of the Queen with the children, one of Diana's favorite books, and a small recipe box with some of the handwritten recipes. She wanted to make the scones that William had loved as a child, to create new memories with old traditions. She also took the journal where they had both written, wanting to keep it with them so they could continue adding entries even when they couldn't be at the cottage. As they locked the door and placed the key back under the mat, William felt a pang of loss. Leaving this place felt like saying goodbye to his grandmother all over again. But Catherine reminded him that they could come back whenever they wanted, that the cottage would always be here waiting for them. It was a gift that would keep on giving, a refuge they could return to throughout their lives. The drive back to London was somber. They held hands in the back seat, both looking out the windows but not really seeing the countryside passing by. They were thinking about what tomorrow would bring, the enormous state funeral that would be watched by millions around the world. They were thinking about having to be strong and composed while their hearts were breaking. They were thinking about their children and how to help them through the hardest day of their young lives. When they arrived back at the palace, the children ran to greet them. George, Charlotte, and Louis threw themselves into their parents' arms, and William held them tight, breathing in the smell of their hair, feeling the warmth of their small bodies. These were the moments that mattered. This was what his grandmother had wanted him to remember. That family love was more important than any crown or title. That evening, they had a quiet family dinner, just the five of them. William told the children stories about their great-grandmother, happy memories that made them smile through their tears. Charlotte asked if they could visit the cottage someday, and William's eyes met Catherine's over the table. Somehow Charlotte knew there was a special place, even though they hadn't mentioned it. Children often understood more than adults gave them credit for. They put the kids to bed early, knowing the next day would be long and difficult. William sat with each child individually, answering their questions about the funeral, explaining what would happen, preparing them as best he could. George, as the oldest, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He asked if he would have to be king someday like great-grandma was queen. William told him yes, but not for a very long time, and that being a good person was more important than being a good king. Charlotte cried herself to sleep, clutching a stuffed corgi that the queen had given her for her last birthday. William stayed with her until she finally drifted off, stroking her hair and singing softly. Louis, too young to fully grasp what was happening, mainly seemed worried because everyone else was sad. Catherine held him and promised that even though they were all sad now, they would be happy again someday. After the children were asleep, William and Catherine went through the schedule for the next day one more time. The funeral would begin at 11 in the morning. They would process behind the coffin with other family members. The service would be held at Westminster Abbey, with leaders from around the world in attendance. After the service, there would be a private burial ceremony for family only. The entire day would be captured by cameras and broadcast globally. William felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He was expected to grieve with dignity, to represent the family with composure, to be a symbol of continuity and strength. But he was also just a grandson who had lost someone he loved dearly. Finding the balance between those two roles seemed impossible. Catherine saw his struggle and pulled him close. She reminded him that his grandmother would want him to be authentic, to feel what he was feeling, to not hide behind a mask. She reminded him about the letter they had found at the cottage, the one that said love was all that mattered. His grandmother would understand if he cried during the funeral. She would want him to mourn honestly. They barely slept that night. Every time William closed his eyes, he saw images of his grandmother, memories playing like a film in his mind. He saw her laughing at family gatherings, offering quiet advice during difficult times, playing with his children, standing strong during national crises. She had been such a constant presence in his life that her absence felt like a hole in the fabric of reality itself. Morning came too soon. The palace staff helped them dress in their formal mourning clothes. William's uniform felt heavy and restrictive. He watched Catherine help Charlotte into her black dress, both of them moving slowly, neither wanting the day to truly begin. George was quiet and pale, trying so hard to be brave. Louis kept asking when they could go play, not understanding why everyone was moving in such a serious way. The car ride to Westminster Abbey was silent, except for the sounds of the city mourning. People lined the streets, thousands and thousands of them, all dressed in black, many crying openly. Flowers were piled everywhere, tributes and messages covering every available surface. The sight of so many people united in grief was overwhelming. Inside the Abbey, William felt like he was moving through water, everything slow and distorted. The building was filled with dignitaries, royalty from other nations, politicians, celebrities, representatives from every corner of the globe. But William barely saw them. His focus was on the coffin draped in the royal standard, on the reality of what lay inside. The service was beautiful and dignified, full of hymns his grandmother had loved, and readings that reflected her faith and values. But William heard it all as if from a distance. He held Catherine's hand so tightly his fingers went numb. Charlotte leaned against him, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. George sat straight and still, tears running down his face but not making a sound. Louis sat in Catherine's lap, confused but sensing he needed to be quiet. When it came time for William to do a reading, he walked to the pulpit on shaking legs. Looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a moment of panic. But then he thought about the cottage, about the letters his grandmother had written, about her belief in him. He took a deep breath and began to read, his voice steady and clear. The words spoke of love and duty, of service and sacrifice, of life and legacy. As he spoke, he felt his grandmother's presence, felt her pride in him, felt her love surrounding him. After the public funeral, there was a smaller private ceremony at Windsor. Only family and very close friends attended the burial. This was where William finally broke down completely. Standing beside the grave with Catherine's arm around him and his children pressed against his legs, he let himself cry without holding back. This was goodbye. This was the final farewell. The burial was simple and peaceful, exactly what the Queen had requested. As earth was placed on the coffin, William thought about everything she had given him, all the lessons, all the love, all the memories. He thought about the cottage and the treasures it held. The weeks after the funeral blurred together in a haze of obligations and adjustments. William threw himself into work, attending meetings, fulfilling duties, stepping into new responsibilities now that his grandmother was gone. Everyone praised him for his strength and dedication, but Catherine worried. She saw how he was avoiding his grief, pushing it down and ignoring it, trying to be strong for everyone else while neglecting his own pain. The children struggled too. Charlotte had trouble sleeping and would wake up crying for her great-grandmother. George became overly serious, trying to act like an adult when he was still just a child. Louis sensed the sadness in the house and became clingy, not wanting to let his parents out of his sight. Catherine did her best to comfort them all while dealing with her own loss. She had loved the Queen too, had learned so much from her, and felt her absence keenly. One night, about 3 weeks after the funeral, Catherine found William sitting alone in his study at 2 a.m, staring at nothing. She sat beside him quietly, not saying anything, just being present. After a long silence, William finally spoke. He said he felt lost, that everything had changed and he didn't know who he was supposed to be anymore. He said he was terrified of letting everyone down, of not being able to fill the enormous shoes his grandmother had left behind. Catherine listened to all of this with a patient heart. Then she reminded him of the cottage, of the letters they had found, of the message his grandmother had left for him. She reminded him that his grandmother's greatest wish was for him to prioritize family and love over duty and image. She reminded him that he didn't have to be perfect, he just had to be himself, honest and compassionate and real. Her words broke through something in William. He finally allowed himself to truly grieve, to cry without holding back, to admit how scared and sad and overwhelmed he felt. Catherine held him through it all, being the anchor she had always been, the steady presence that kept him grounded. They stayed up all night talking, remembering, crying, and slowly beginning to heal. The next morning, William made a decision. He told Catherine they needed to go back to the cottage, all 5 of them this time. The children needed to see it, needed to connect with their great-grandmother's memory in a tangible way. Catherine agreed immediately. She had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to push him. They cleared their schedules for a long weekend and told the staff they were taking the family on a private trip. The children were excited about the adventure, not knowing where they were going but sensing it was important. The drive to Scotland was different this time, filled with the kids' chatter and questions. William felt lighter than he had in weeks. He was taking his family to a place that had brought him peace and he was ready to share it with them. When they arrived at the cottage, the kids tumbled out of the car and immediately wanted to explore. William and Catherine led them inside, watching their faces as they took in all the photographs and memories. Charlotte immediately gravitated to pictures of herself with the Queen, touching them gently and smiling through tears. George studied the photographs seriously, asking questions about different people and events. Louis was more interested in the toys he found, old treasures that had belonged to royal children long ago. William sat his children down and told them about the cottage, about how their great-grandmother had created this special place to keep family memories safe. He showed them the boxes in the cellar with their names on them, the collections she had started for each of them. Charlotte cried when she saw how many things the Queen had saved just for her. George was quiet but deeply moved. Even Louis seemed to understand this was something important. Over the next few days, they added their own memories to the cottage. William took new photographs of the children playing in the garden. Catherine helped them plant flowers that would bloom every spring. They found the journal and helped the kids add their own entries, drawings, and simple words about their great-grandmother. George wrote about how she always listened to his stories. Charlotte wrote about how much she missed the Queen's hugs. Louis drew a picture of a crown with lots of colors. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, and William would tell stories about his grandmother, stories the children had never heard before. He told them about her sense of humor, about times she had played pranks or laughed until she cried. He told them about her strength during hard times, about how she had ruled with wisdom and compassion for so many decades. He told them about finding this cottage and discovering how much she had loved her family. Catherine added her own memories, stories of times the Queen had given her advice or support, times she had shown kindness that the public never saw. She told the children about the day she married their father, and how nervous she had been, and how the Queen had taken her aside and told her that love was more important than perfection, that being genuine was worth more than being polished. The children listened with wide eyes, soaking up these stories, building their own relationship with their great-grandmother's memory. The cottage became a place where the Queen felt alive to them, not as a distant monarch but as a real person who had loved them and wanted good things for them. On their last evening at the cottage, after the children were asleep, William and Catherine sat together on the back porch looking at the stars. William said he felt different now, more settled in his grief. He said he understood what his grandmother had been trying to teach him through this gift. It wasn't about the cottage itself or the objects inside it. It was about remembering what mattered most, about keeping love and family at the center of everything, about balancing duty with humanity. Catherine agreed. She said the Queen had lived an extraordinary life, but what made it truly remarkable wasn't the crown or the power. It was the love she had given and received, the relationships she had nurtured, the family she had cherished. That was the real legacy, and it was something they could continue. They talked about bringing the children back regularly, making the cottage a tradition, a place where the family could reconnect and remember. They talked about continuing to add to the collections, creating boxes for future grandchildren, keeping the Queen's vision alive. They talked about teaching their children to value relationships over status, love over duty, authenticity over image. When they returned to London, something had shifted in all of them. They were still sad, still missed the Queen terribly, but they had found a way to carry her with them that felt healthy and hopeful. William was able to fulfill his duties without losing himself in them. The children seemed more settled, more able to talk about their feelings. Catherine felt like they had turned a corner as a family. William established a new routine. Once a month, he would spend a day at the cottage alone, going through the archives, reading his grandmother's letters, adding to the collections. It became his meditation, his way of staying connected to her and to the values she represented. Sometimes Catherine would join him. Sometimes he would bring one of the children, sometimes he would go alone. The cottage became a constant in their lives, a reminder of what mattered. Months passed, then a year. The acute grief softened into a gentle sadness that they learned to live with. The Queen's presence was felt not in her absence, but in the lessons she had taught, the love she had given, the example she had set. William found himself making decisions based on what she would have wanted, not from obligation, but from genuine understanding of her wisdom. On the first anniversary of her death, they returned to the cottage as a family. They brought flowers from the palace gardens, the same kind the Queen had loved. They planted them around the cottage, creating a living memorial. The children had grown and changed so much in a year, but their connection to their great-grandmother remained strong, nurtured by the stories and memories shared in this special place. William stood in the garden, watching his children play among the flowers, listening to their laughter echo through the hills. Catherine came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. They didn't need to speak. They both understood what this moment meant, how far they had come, how the grief had transformed from something that threatened to overwhelm them into something they could carry with grace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. William thought about his grandmother watching the same sunsets from this same spot, finding peace in the beauty of simple moments. He understood now what she had been trying to give him. It wasn't just a cottage or a collection of memories. It was permission to be human, to feel deeply, to love fully, to remember that beneath the titles and responsibilities, they were just people who loved each other. As darkness fell and they called the children inside, William took one last look at the garden, at the cottage that held so much love. He whispered a quiet thank you to his grandmother, for everything she had given him, for the wisdom she had shared, for the love that would never die. Then he went inside to his family, to the life she had wanted him to embrace, carrying her memory not as a burden, but as a blessing that would light his way forward.